Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and whether you listen to me live on Fresh FM, the greatest little radio station in the South Island and probably the world, from sunny old Nelson, or you're listening to me on my podcast. This is Ben Vidgen, the dyslexic detective, bringing you the Deadline Report. Today's show, which is also Shipping News 14 for my subscribers, I'm going to basically recap what I've actually been up to in the last 12 months. And I'm going to introduce you to a few new heroes, one of them which you're looking at right now. This is actually Nicky Hagers' new book out this Christmas. Nicky dropped me off a copy of it just before it says Christmas, and that's the Peace Monger, Owen Wilkes, international peace researcher. This man is an absolute hero, and I actually mentioned him in this particular issue of the Deadline, which I've just been putting out all around the South Island, and we'll be putting it out to the North Island as well. That's the last, unfortunately, in that format. We're going to be changing into a different format next year, but I'm not stopping. We keep chugging along, but we just have to adapt and overcome. But this is the issue that we've concentrated on this year, was the kind of the resumption of the US military into New Zealand since ANZUS, and we look at the history of some of the people telling us about things then that we should be paying attention to now, because they're very, very relevant in terms of that build-up and in terms of what America wants from the Pacific and how it impacts us, America, and of course good old China as well. Cover by Dean Raybould, which you can't see if you're listening to me on the radio. But I have put out a YouTube on this one, so I hope, Matt, you will forgive me, because in this one I'm sort of trying to do all three things, just because of time and energy. It's like the trip I just spent around the South Island has been very, very time consuming, and I just need to get a bit of a break before getting into the new year, so I'm kind of like I'm cheating, basically. So, yes, that's the Ben New Zealand magazine, which Owen Wilkes has mentioned in there as well. But I will just hold that up a little bit there, because for the piece, I'm just sitting at home watching the television, and I'm sure you don't want to see that, so you'd rather see the Peace Monger, which is Owen Wilkes. Owen Wilkes is a remarkable individual. He studied at Canterbury University in physics, didn't actually go on to complete his degree, but physics and geology, I think, were the things that he had a real passion for, as well as archaeology. And a lot of this book that Nicky Hager writes, the book I like about it is actually the back chapter, and it kind of, it's the Wilkes How to Guide to Public Interest Researching, which what Nicky and I sort of tried to talk about that last year, and I think I probably owe Nicky a bit of an apology, because I think I was a little bit off topic about what he meant by public research in terms of what he means here. Owen Wilkes was a man that combined many methodologies that were all using information available in the public arena to present basically information that people needed to know about, and in a way that provided very authenticated and very factual based data that couldn't really be refuted because it's so well researched. And he basically wants to be an independent journalist or an activist or a researcher. Owen Wilkes basically set the guide in terms of how to go about those steps. And Nicky's book kind of goes through that and takes you through many steps as his work in Sweden, where Owen was actually kicked out because he just used to read newspapers and put two and two together and write up these wonderfully beautiful papers that, again, Nicky goes into why these papers worked in terms of Owen's skill as an analyst. And then he goes into basically what Owen did was in the 1670s, looking at all these sort of antennas that the Americans were bringing into New Zealand, and being told that they were these, they're just this, for looking at the stars or whatever. And then Owen, by his field work and by going out and taking photographs and sketches of the signals, would then go away and take them to experts and learn. And basically, he became a walking encyclopedia on all things military, and was a very, very, during his time, very well consulted, New Zealand-wise and nationwide. And it's quite a statement that we don't know more about him. Like, we applaud rugby players and sports people and celebrities, and here's a guy that's actually trying to stop the world from annihilating itself. And he's not people who are educated do know about Owen Wilkes. Educated in terms of current affairs and the history, current affairs of history of New Zealand. They know his role and part in it. But outside of that, he's sort of been largely missed by the mainstream. No surprises. So that's Owen's book, and we mentioned that again in my book, my magazine. And this is basically again where I'm revisiting where we are with our nuclear-free legacies. Where I'm, the article caption here is Jacinda warned rocket labs launches could break nuclear-free laws. And okay, the fact of the matter is, when it came to Rocket Lab, which turned out to be actually a tool of basically a military war toy. We were sold that it was a New Zealand thing. It was all about studying peaceful space, and that all turned out to be a complete lie through a lot of public relations, which largely have been promoted by corporate mainstream media. They have really bought everything hook, line, and sinker without actually really questioning or going and doing the level of research that Owen would do. Things like in Starlink, it's just Starlink, it'll be great to give us faster internet, but we now know, it's links to the Pentagon. And again, just, talking about there and effectively looking at things like Canterbury University, the military research they did for the Americans in the 60s, 70s and 80s, and how that's now happening actually now. The archive material, again, where I mentioned that in terms of the Wellington National Archives mountain or declassified research into how New Zealand universities, Australian New Zealand scientists were involved in New Zealand and missile defence research extensively from 1959 to the current day, includes references to scientists Marsden, Pickering, Rutherford, Leach, plus military-funded atmospheric research throughout the South Island, including Omega, which is what Owen Wilkes largely exposed, Canterbury proposed, plus Mount John, Black Birch, Blenheim, Long Blanc, Benham. These are all military projects that, again, Owen Wilkes exposed as happening in the 80s, and that were passed into the same sort of BS and spin doctrine that we're actually now encountering now. So really, really worthwhile. The timing that Nicky's book actually came out at the end of Christmas, just at the same time I actually delivered those magazines around the South Island, and instead they're due out to the North Island shortly. There's a wonderful bit of serendipity. And again, an example where two independent journalists who we're not joined at the hip, but we've been talking, we sent emails, have been able to kind of come up with projects independently, but kind of collectively give ourselves that voice, which, we're not we're all independent organisations, but, Nicky's written his book, I've produced my magazine. Collectively, that gives us that much more firepower, while, again, retaining our autonomy. So that was actually just, and it wasn't planned, that was just, we both had, Nicky's got a very close relationship with Owen Wilkes as well, and I haven't had the privilege of actually meeting Owen directly. Knew lots of his friends, and influenced heavily by his work, and people like Murray Horton, who, I don't always see eye to eye with Murray Horton, but again, there's a level of passionate for wanting to be a good planetary citizen, which has to be commended. And you don't always have to see eye to eye on things. It's just about case of whether you're moving in the same direction, I guess, and sometimes. This guy also was very instrumental about basically getting into the universities and actually, getting those students passionate about these subjects as well, and really giving them for a whole source of people that collectively made sure that the university students were aware of, they weren't just reading the newspapers and television stations and believing it, they were actually being exposed to information from solidly well-documented sources, which pretty much would challenge the status quo. In fact, I would say the university papers such as Cantor and Critic and the Salient of the 70s and 80s, influenced by people like Owen Wilkes, produced some of the best investigative journalism in the country now, and it's a terrible shame when you look at the content of a student mag now, which is, they're basically lightweight waffle, which is mistaking opinion for actually research, and then basically kind of having the gall to turn around and challenge people who are actually doing that work, and doing it with more integrity than just basically offering out. And not to say that those opinions aren't valuable or that it's completely like that, but just literally I'll end it with saying, go to the archives, get off your freaking internets, go to the archives, read what's actually there produced by academics and activists of that period, and then look at what we're actually getting today on social media and through the universities. And you judge yourself whether or not our independent media is in trouble. And again, I guess the one thing I would say there is that, Owen Wilkes was never a man who did what he did, running out there and said, do this because I'm trying to create a political party, come and vote for me. I'm the truth seeker, I'm the freedom, or do this and buy my merchandise, which I think are the two red flags. So if someone comes across you and says they're an independent journalist, and yet they have an affiliation with a political organisation or any kind of institute, regardless of what their ideology is, or they're doing it to clearly make more than just a living, then I'd say those are two red flags that you really have to ask yourself, is that independent media or is that something else? And, a lot of people aren't really getting into that question. So into 10 minutes and 29 minutes on the Deadline Report, Fresh FM, and I'll be back to talk about a whole bunch of other things. We'll try and kind of cover a whole bunch of pieces, but I think that this is my song that I dedicate to Nicky Hagers for writing the piece Monger, and for the great Owen Wilkes, who has inspired much of my work. And I cannot stress, I often talk about somebody else's country, and that's a documentary that's like, if you don't listen to anything else, then I say go and watch that documentary, go and watch it. Well, I say the same thing. I place Owen Wilkes in that same category in terms of being a wonderful writer, researcher, analyst, who exposed us to a lot of things which are actually happening again. And, where we are now is, he came out of the period of the a product of the Cuban Missile Crisis when we were 2 minutes to midnight, the point of total nuclear annihilation. Well, we are now sitting at the point of 100 seconds of midnight, and we are should be way more actually up alarmed basically about this arms race that has been just driven by the same maniacs that were, around in the 70s and 80s engaging in Owen Wilkes' place, and we're largely ignorant of the history of people like Owen Wilkes and his counterparts, and so we've really been quite, where history has been rewritten from the weapons of mass destructions and what the Americans knew about that, and Colin Rolls, Powell and the Bush and Reagan and Clinton administration. That's all largely been sort of downplayed and brushed to the side, and it's been brushed to the side by the same people largely who are pushing the buttons now and were pushing the buttons then. So they have a vested interest. Anyway, let's do this. This is the Peace Train by Cat Stevens, which I'm told there's a William Shatner version out there, but God, let's not think about that and boldly go someplace which isn't going to fry amounts. Again, there's Peace Monger, Owen Wilkes, for those who are looking at the YouTube. It's available in good bookshops. There's the Ben's New Zealand. That's available around all your cafes in Nelson if you're wandering around, or the South Island, and Wellington and other parts of New Zealand. If you haven't got one, get in contact with me by Facebook, and I'm sure we can arrange to get you a hard copy of the Ben's New Zealand. So here we are, the Peace Train. And we're back on Fresh FM, or actually just taking a recap for those watching me on YouTube. And we have been discussing my magazine and my basically looking at the role of Five Eyes in the US kind of remilitarization of New Zealand space and territory since 2010, and how this has been a grossly underreported story. And, it's sort of happening at a really rapid rate, and we're not really paying attention to some people that really need to be questioned, and whether or not we want them in our country or involved in our politics. Or in fact having more of a say than they actually should, which is not to say, as I do a close-up on Uncle Sam, a big eagle with his claws of the South Island, and little Chinese that say that China, not saying that America alone is the big bad wolf here, but we are dealing with some pretty deja vu sense of history. So we dealt with that, and we dealt with Owen Wilkes' The Peacemonger by Nicky Hagers. And other than that, I've been having a wonderful trip around the South Island, meeting all sorts of really interesting people, and I'm just putting a little bit of a blank over the cover, because I just want to kind of you to focus on the voice now and not the background, which is holding up Owen's book and Ben's NZ for the YouTubers so they can see what it gives you a visual aid. But I'd like to just get back to talking about some other things now. So we'll just remove your eye candy. And now you'll have to use the power of the ears, like those poor people in Radioland. Okay, so I met some wonderful people, and I've seen some pretty incredible things. Obviously, there were the fireworks that took place in Wanaka, which caused the big fire down the South Island. Correction, towards Arrowtown. Another one of these billionaires. They put it up on the story. Oh, this guy's a billionaire, and he makes product X. And they didn't really kind of get into his role in the Robin Hood Foundation and what those people's links are to the Labour Party and the National Party. And it's a long list of billionaires that have been coming into New Zealand, again, both under Labour and National's watch. And, let's just roll off some of the names. I can't actually remember the fireworks guy, but, speaking of fireworks, we've got Kim.com, also now living in Queenstown, basically hijacked the Internet Mana Party by waving a big checkbook, but had been quite happily beforehand wooing the City of Auckland with $1 million worth of fireworks and $50,000 checks to John Banks of the former National and Auckland, I think Banks was an Auckland mayor, an old boy. So, it's like he's not actually, I question Kim.com. I don't think he's a saint by any kinds, although in saying that he's not, as I said, I agreed Broadmoor from Weather Workshops, and I asked him about that, and he said on air, when I interviewed him, he said, Kim.com is a villain. He's a very small villain compared to a lot of corporations that basically wanted him, rounded up and arrested. But that's another story. I said, we've got Kim.com, we've got Peter Thiel, who's the guy that created Facebook, who, again, basically trying to buy up all sorts of land in Wanaka and Queenstown and trying to have his way and basically ride roughshod over what the locals actually want because he's got the money. You have billionaires like Julian Robinson, who's a very good friend of John Key's, basically promoting New Zealand as a bolt hole investment place that you can come and bring your money and be safe and don't worry about the government because they're all into things like tax evasion and so on. John Key, Julian Roberts' good friend, is the John Griffin, who owned the place in Cape Kidnappers, where Ardern was going to get married, but that didn't happen. But Griffin runs the Robin Hood Foundation, which is a big, huge charity in New York, which actually is just a big, giant fucking tax dodge. And again, when I've brought up many, many times that John Key's own meddling with our tax laws really need to be taken into account of what he allowed. He basically institutionalised money laundering for the way he increase the limits. You could donate as much as you like. You get a 33%. So you donate to your buddy's charity, you get 33% back, and then your buddy gets to do something which he probably would have done anyway, but it's nice and subsidised. So it's basically corporatised welfare, which is, when you start to talk about public-private partnership, that's what you're talking about. So that was John Griffin. And then, of course, we've got all the Google guys that are sitting up playing, people like Bill Gates, and people go, oh, yeah, but Bill Gates, that's just a conspiracy. No, what we're talking about is a group of people that have centralised the wealth to the point that 0.1%, listen to that, 0.1% of the population now controls over 50% of the resources on the planet. And the outcome, the social side effects of that are proving to be, they want you to believe it's climate change. Don't get me wrong, the way that the human planet, consumerism is operating is doing terrible damage to this planet, its environmental and its weather. And yet things like famine are not a byproduct necessarily of those weather products, although themselves can be argued are driven by man-made causes. It is, however, the overall logistical and aid responses, and the reason that those people don't have resources is actually because of this centralisation of wealth. And of course, it's now being promoted, you see on the television, because of the war in the Ukraine. Much like the failure of our health system has been blamed on COVID, I cry bullshit on that, because anybody that has been paying attention, reading the newspapers about what has been happening in the third world and what has been happening in the health sector in terms of being privatised again by this TPPA-driven and RECP, because remember, New Zealand's tied up to both of these kind of corporate cartel-driven legitimisation of corporate cartelism. As the end result has been that these people have been just getting more and more and more, and it's been happening way before COVID or the war in the Ukraine occurred. And that's literally, you can follow it from the 1980s, 90% of the world's resources in the hands of 10%, to where we are now, 2022, it's now 0.1% in the hands of 50%. And that's been a rapid transfer of wealth, which has really just been accelerated and brought to the public attention probably in the last, and I mean public attention, I mean Not necessarily the 10 or 20% of people who read pain, current affairs, energy, but I'm talking about the day-to-day thought process about things, think about it. Don't normally do it because they're doing jobs and then they go home and look after the kids and put the food away and do that 7 days, 5 days a week and plus the weekends, and really don't have much time. I'm talking Joe Public, he hasn't really thought about this until now when it's becoming directly actually impacting their own lives. So we're also going to be looking at some of these issues, and I'm going to be looking at I've been going through the archives of the 1980s, looking at some of the so-called heroes of the 80s, and then looking at what actually happened to them and what the impact, how that is impacting us now. This whole process of neoliberalism, which hasn't actually stopped, and it is entirely criminal. And the point I will drive in my next article is that actually it's about time we started looking at some of these names that don't even get mentioned, that really are the biggest buildings in Wellington, the Cape, fuck the WASP factory, fuck even the New Zealand Treasury. Let's start talking about PricewaterhouseCoopers. Let's start talking about KPMG. Let's start talking about Deloitte. Let's start talking about some of these people who apparently their poop don't smell, and yet it really, really does. And I think maybe there's a time that we need to start doing a lot more public exposure of some of these people who are profiting at great levels, and also advising, and also being able to control the public relations narrative. So we'll take a short break, and we'll play with Bob Bobolina, which is a great song, which is all about public relations and PR gurus. And you're on the Deadline Report, and we'll just wrap it up because we've got just about 29 minutes anyway. So come back and see me next week, Sunday, every 7 p.m. For those who are in the shipping news who want to actually get more information, because we're going to have some great guests on board coming up next week. Just do start listening to me on a Sunday, or even listening to the podcast, because again, this is where I kind of work all week to give you the best of the best, and all my Facebook pages are all leading towards that. And I'll see you next week. This is the Deadline Report, Fresh FM, the greatest little show in the South Island, and probably, station I should say, but it will probably be the world. Thank you very much. See you next Sunday at 7 p.m.